We're now delighted to have Steve Wilford, who's a senior partner for Asia Pacific at Control Risks. I'm sure you all know Control Risks, the global risk assessment and consulting. Steve's been a director in corporate investigations. He's investigated governments for corruption, provided joint venture risk assessment, and also advised on extortion cases. So it's great to have him here taking us through the risks you need to know about in Asia Pacific. I think a slide's there. Thank you.
Okay. Morning, everybody. Thanks for having me. As just mentioned, I come from a company called Control Risks. The name of the company is deceptively simple, and we largely do what the company name suggests. But that covers a really quite extraordinary spectrum of quite interesting and sometimes extreme things. So just as an insight, we are either public or private, the largest kidnap for ransom negotiation firm in the world. That's how we began life in 1975. But in Asia Pacific, we're one of the largest corporate investigations firms. So many of the deals that your clients clamber into private jets to close, we carry out a lot of the background work to ensure that the integrity of those deals is beyond reproach. On the way over, I was trying to think a little bit more carefully about where our industries merge, if you like. I mean, on a very practical and obvious level, we have a joint venture with International SOS, which is one of the world's largest medical evacuation firms, and our demand for private aircraft is actually quite dense. But on a more sort of esoteric level, I feel that we're sort of both kind of the concierges of globalization. You know, at least since the end of the Cold War, Control Risks has been looking after the transactions, looking after the people doing those transactions in a globalized world, in emerging markets, and that's really been a core focus of our business. Similarly, your industry has been getting people there and back in a timely manner. I want to just take a little bit of a departure for the next 10 minutes away from the aircraft industry, if you like, per se, and just reflect back to you 5 points of interest that really have been fed back to us by many of our C-suite clients in Asia-Pac. So the 5 things I want to talk to you about are really some of the 5 most important things that are vexing the kind of people that are the customers to your industry. And hopefully it's sort of useful background to your decision making. So just to kick off and hoping things work, the first thing I want to talk about is probably pretty obvious, and that is the current state of US-China relations. If we're talking about the health of the regional economy, I think this particular issue is really at the forefront of so many of our clients at the moment, not simply those doing business in China, but doing business in Asia more broadly. I think the one thing to say about this is it's not really a trade war. Trade at the moment is simply a facet of what has become a pretty entrenched hardening of relationships between China and the United States. In the context of the United States, it's not equally just a Trump administration issue. I think for many of the Americans in the audience who are following the presidential campaign trail already, listening to what's being said on the stump, the new tough on China mantra is a very bipartisan position now. Nobody's going to win any votes being conciliatory towards China in the next presidential campaign. And this is throwing up a set of significant concerns for some of the major corporates globally. The latest issue that we're talking to our clients about is China's mooted retaliation to the latest step up in the tariff war, and the suggestion that there might be a list of companies that are no longer desirable or wanted as operators inside the Chinese economy, and our clients are screaming down the phone at us, are we going to be on it? We're a major supplier to Huawei. What does that mean in terms of our political risk, both to United States regulation and to retribution from China? And that is putting a significant drag on decision making. It's putting a significant slowdown on deal making, and I suppose for you guys that could have knock-on effects in the year ahead in terms of companies making decisions around that ultimate expression of business confidence, which is the buying or leasing of a private aircraft. The second thing I wanted to talk to you about is a little bit more out there, but again, if I had to sort of tot up the number of boardroom conversations out of Singapore, Hong Kong, Shanghai, this comes up now all the time. And what I'm talking about here in terms of sort of the global data regulation standoff is really we're seeing a trifurcation of cyberspace. That sounds quite a grand statement, but basically, let me put it in simpler terms. The United States, notwithstanding a few congressional committees, still views the use of data as essentially something available to the highest bidder. It's still very much a sort of commercial object. You go to the European Union, many of you all have done the training. Data is now all part of the sanctity and privacy of the individual. It's to be owned and managed by the individual and regulated on behalf of the individual. And then we come to Chinese cyberspace. And Chinese cyberspace is a very different beast again. Without wanting to create a particularly negative picture, the Chinese state wants to own cyberspace in China. And most of the mega platforms that China runs, many of the social programs that now feed into those platforms, day-to-day transactions, are all viewed as property of the state and will increasingly be viewed as such. And the China cybersecurity law is a very grey and complex piece of legislation that really annoys many of our clients in China, but basically what it boils down to is the state owns the data that is generated out of China, so please mess with it, take it out of China at your peril. And bringing it, hopefully, back to a degree of relevance to business executives moving around Asia, we are finding an increasing number of them falling foul of the restrictions around Chinese cyberspace, and their business models, more importantly, are becoming increasingly difficult to execute in the context of Chinese cyberspace and the rest. And I'll come back to right at the end for my sort of final point about the difficulties nowadays in executing regional strategies for major businesses and the potential knock-on effects that could have for travel. This is all interrelated, but when I talk to business people, obviously particularly US domiciled ones, but not exclusively, their concern with the certain amount of gridlock that's within the US decision-making process, and particularly as it applies to diplomacy in this region, is a concern. Probably a short-term concern, but one nonetheless that's dominating the thinking of our clients in the months ahead, certainly in the run-up to the presidential election. And it's not just about the somewhat knee-jerk and combative nature of US-Chinese trade relations. It extends to vaguenesses about how the United States is going to view Vietnam's success story, if you like, off the back of this trade dispute, whether trade relations between the United States and Vietnam as a kind of China plus one economy of choice right now in the region are going to grow or are going to face hurdles of their own. And that actually transfers to a number of other economies in the region that are operating significant deficits with the United States as well. Just as a number 4, control risks has always kept an eye on environmental issues, but we're essentially a business risk company that has a sort of background in hard security, so it's never actually been at the forefront of our thinking, but it's really come to the forefront of our clients' thinking. I mean, if you think, about recent cases of activist shareholders demanding oil companies change radically their investment model and their growth model. If you think about the amount of infrastructure that's been seriously damaged in this region by inclement weather events in recent years, you think about the insured amount of damage that's taken place across Asia Pac related to extreme weather incidents in recent years, it's really actually coming to the forefront of many major corporates' thinking. And then if you think about the aviation sector and reputational risk, that is also a growing focus within the media in terms of, the tension between individualistic air travel and environmental concerns, perhaps, and the technological evolution that's possibly being driven by those environmental concerns. But for me, as a kind of workaday sort of guy who has to deal with operational risk issues for clients on the ground, it's actually more the cynical manipulation of environmental concerns in the region that's really had my team busy in recent months and years. And by that I mean foreign companies in the extractive sector I don't want to be cruel to Indonesia, but because it's not exclusive to that country, but let's just use it as an example, have faced significant problems from predatory officials who are carrying out acts of extortion and using environmentalism, if you like, to leverage that threat. And we're seeing growing instances of that amongst our clients, and that has serious knock-on effects in terms of business interruption and even incarceration of senior executives. So if you like, that's the concern with the environment in this part of the world. It's not just a Western issue being mobilized cynically by officials, sometimes by competing companies, to actually damage the interests of our clients. And that's really, unfortunately, been a growth area in the past year, and it's likely to continue. And then just to finish off on point number 5, which is a bit more esoteric, and it's nationalist politics confronting multinationals. Your clients have succeeded over the past 25 to 30 years, acceleratingly so in the last 10, because of the ease of ideas, talent, capital being able to move from one jurisdiction to another. That's been the success story that we've all shared in. My company's shared in it. Most of you have shared in it. What we're seeing increasingly now, and I guess the US-China hardening of positions, the trade war, is but a more extreme, more high-profile element of this, but right around the region, from Thailand to Malaysia to the Philippines to India, we've seen, if you like, a change in attitudes towards international regulation, towards the ease with which capital, people, investments can travel. It's becoming increasingly localized. The regulatory regimes are less mindful now in the areas of environment, cyberspace, In fact, international accounting standards, you name it, they're becoming less concerned with the international norms which governed much of the business that people using private aircraft have done in recent years. And that is making regional strategy and the execution of it much more problematic. It's not impossible. It's actually in many of the jurisdictions where I work growing, but it's becoming more complicated. And potentially, if you're trying to think about your industry and the sort of density of travel that's going to be necessitated by these changes, actually you could see a growth in your sector. The need to be on the ground quickly in increasingly more obscure places to have face-to-face conversations in the process of deals is actually becoming more necessary, not less, in the context of this. And that in itself does present an opportunity. Similarly, just to finish off on an optimistic note, the headlines are currently dominated by closure, if you like, closure of international relations, closure of interaction, closure of trade. But actually, many parts of Asia-Pacific's economy right now is booming, and that includes China. And many parts of Asia-Pacific economy within the more difficult context that I just described is actually opening up. So if you take the example of financial services, China, behind the current headlines, is actually liberalizing that sector. It's actually making it easier for a lot of major Western corporates to do much more interesting things in the world of finance right now. That's not at the top of the news cycle at the moment. So it's a story in the year ahead and beyond of one of growing complexity for the people who travel in your aircraft, offset by increasing amounts of opportunity. And I think that's essentially the picture that we have in the year ahead. So thank you very much. I don't know whether there's any questions.
That was great. One thing you didn't touch on is territorial tensions. There's a lot of focus on the South China Sea.
Yeah.
Why?
I mean, territorial tensions would have a sort of an immediate and deleterious effect on travel, and from the Korean Peninsula to the South China Sea to the border with India and Pakistan are all major potential regional flashpoints. Control risk position on all of those flashpoints actually becoming situations that have a prolonged impact on the ability of people to move around is low. We've seen, if you like, the most live example was the recent aerial jousting between India and Pakistan that did have momentary impact on air travel and air routes. But the emphatic point is momentary. Similarly, China's tit-for-tat declarations of air exclusion zones, etc., and U.S. freedom of navigation acts in the South China Sea at the moment are just an expression of the overall vying between China and the United States for, in the case of the US, continued presence and domination of the region, and in China's case, its sense that it wants to return to its rightful position as, if you like, regional hegemon. But the point here is neither side wants this to turn into a real shooting match that could have those kind of serious travel implications. That's not on the cards. The most erratic one of the three would be the Korean Peninsula, where you have a spread of risk in that jurisdiction between the love affair that Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un have expressed for each other, continuing to some extent, essentially that standoff being put on hold, continuing to be on hold, to a complete regression to the missile testing and fiery rhetoric that we were experiencing only a couple of years ago, and that would have localized implications for travel, but not regional implications, in our opinion.
Great. We've got a question from the audience on Slido. What's the Asian regional terrorism risk? And do you see regional aviation as a target?
Terrorists love aviation, don't they? It's kind of an iconic sort of target for terror, but it's become, in recent years, very, very difficult to do, almost impossibly so. And if you look at the recent track record of terrorism in the region, it's really sort of reflected the global pattern of quite low tech, open target, mass casualty style of attacks, which have a limited short-term impact on people's desire to travel to certain jurisdictions, Sri Lanka being the most recent and obvious example. But in the overall scheme of things, don't tell the terrorists this, but I think terrorism in Asia-Pac has singularly failed to terrorize. And if you actually look at the economic implications of it over the past 10 years, they've been pretty much, over that longer term period, almost negligible. And the direct threat to aviation will always, I think, remain, because it is an iconic target. But in terms of that then targeting private aviation, it's much more limited. The most likely threat to the sector is probably some kind of attack in an airport building, or some kind of attack on an airport perimeter. And globally, we've seen that to be the case, and Asia's no different in that regard.
Okay, any old-fashioned questions? Okay, the final one. You know, we bring you here as a geopolitical expert, and someone wants a kidnapping story on Slido. But I noticed one of the risks you're identifying is virtual kidnapping. How does that work?
Virtual kidnapping. Oh, I mean, it's quite a complicated story, but I'll try and summarize it really quickly. It's the major growth area. We have to deal with a lot of this. It's very popular for a number of reasons. Nobody gets hurt. Nobody actually gets kidnapped. And essentially, it's a piece of very clever double dealing, where you convince one party that the other party is actually being kidnapped, and you get them to pay up, whereas in fact all they've been done is they've been detained by a phone call, or they've been taken on a taxi journey, or they've had their mobile phone stolen. And in that very short period of time, you can force the counterparty to part with a significant amount of money. It's a very so, for example, high net worth individuals from China have really suffered from a lot of virtual kidnapping. It's where one member of the family goes to Vietnam, goes to India, for example, and they're just taken offline by one way or another for an hour, literally as little time as that, and within that 60 minutes you can extract a significant amount of money by posing as a kidnapper, by making threats against a family that has ready access to significant amounts of money. That's virtual kidnapping. Whereas in fact often the victim is simply sat in their hotel room.
I'm slightly worried that several people were writing that down as a business plan, not as a... Thank you. Thank you so much. That was brilliant. We really appreciate you coming.
Thanks very much.
Thank you very much.